Welcome to Ike Reads the News, the show where I read the news and tell you what I think about it. This first article is Our Radicalized Republic. Can President Biden or anyone else overcome years of rising partisan hatred? And so it starts with a political scientist named Liliana Mason as she's trying to understand the current state of radicalization and where we go from here. And she starts with a pretty grim stat where 15 to 20% of Americans think that physical violence against their political opponents was not a deal breaker. This kind of culminates in the January 6th riots as a group of insurrectionists stormed the Capitol and were looking for violence and were looking to overturn the results of the election due to, being propelled on by the sitting president. They give a couple of reasons for why this radicalization is happening. They point to white Americans' resentment of Black Americans, growth in income inequality, and how we feel about our political opponents, to name just a few. They also say that rates of this thinking violence is okay are pretty similar on the right and the left, but people on the right are much more likely to engage in actual violence, especially over the last decade. So part one is Decades of Drift. It's talking about the history of radicalization and what's been going on in the last couple of decades in the US specifically. So there are a couple underlying trends that really lead to this conflict and hatred of the other side. And so they're the same things that I talked about earlier. Specifically political polarization, conflict over who counts as one of us, which is really a racial issue, income inequality, as well as trust or mistrust in political institutions. And so over the last couple decades, we're seeing all of these really worsen. So if we're looking at the share of respondents who say that racial discrimination is the main reason Black people can't get ahead, we're seeing the gap really widen between Democrats and Republicans. What's interesting is that the total rate of respondents hasn't changed that much. There's just really been a sorting. If you believe it, you're going to be a Democrat. If you don't believe it, you're typically going to be a Republican. And we're seeing that accelerate, especially over the last decade. If we're looking at income inequality, we're seeing how wealth is distributed among upper, middle, and lower income Americans. And it's becoming, the gap is really widening, where upper income Americans control about 80% of the wealth, middle Americans control about 20%, and lower income Americans control like a negligible amount. This stops in 2016, but it's hard to imagine this trend really reversing in the last few years. And then if we're looking at trust in political institutions, we're seeing that trust in the executive branch has gone down, as well as trust in the legislative branch has gone down. And so these are all things that we think would really lead to radicalization, just as you're uncomfortable, you think the other side isn't doing enough, you're really siloed and just uncomfortable with the current state of affairs. And so part two is Polarization Nation, is talking about the current state of what's going on. And I think this chart is really interesting. So it's how many friends you have of the other side. And so among Trump supporters, 39% of them have no friends who voted for Biden. Among Biden supporters, 42% have no friends who voted for Trump. These are pretty alarming statistics because it's very easy to think the other side is evil or unhuman if you can't have those conversations with the other side and humanize them. It also talks about how more and more we're being siloed or being sorted based on non-ideological tendencies. And so they point out religion. I think mask wearing is a really good one, where whether or not you wear a mask is kind of a indicator of party, which is only accelerating those trends and accelerating whether you wear a mask or not. It also points to race as a pretty good example of this. And so this is looking at your views on racial issues. And what's really interesting about this is how politically homogenous or diverse your group is. That's like the coworkers, friends you have, the people you surround yourself with, is a bigger indicator of your views on racial issues than actually how racially diverse your network is. And so here's a picture from the January 6th riots, as they're obviously looking to kill Nancy Pelosi and Mike Pence, among other people. And so with race, they're talking about how, in the past, people would just be racist, where now you don't necessarily have to be racist. Instead, you can just hate Democrats because there is such a big separation and segregation between the political parties. And they talk about voter suppression as an easy example of this, as one side has been making it easier to vote. The other side has been really fighting hard to make it harder to vote, which harms the other party as well as harming minorities. And so part 3 is No Way Out. It's talking about where we go from here, what we can do to fix it. And so a lot of these trends are kind of a vicious cycle. As there's more polarization, racism, income inequality, isolation, and mistrust, you get more and more extreme leaders, which only worsens all of these problems. So there are solutions. They talk about dialogue. If you have friends on the other side, of course, it's important to reach out, understand where they're coming from, and let them know where you're coming from. They also say that it's impossible to reverse these trends without fixing the underlying issues. So if we think about income inequality, for example, it's really important that we solve that and make sure that average Americans are getting a livable and a fair wage. Thinking about 2016, Trump definitely wasn't the cause of any of these things. He was just kind of the logical progression of what was happening, especially with just the alarming rhetoric. One other thing they mention is that Republican politicians overestimate how conservative their constituents are, and so their positions are much more extreme than even the people voting for them, which is really dangerous because a lot of the rhetoric and the dialogue trickles down. And so one other thing the authors mention is that the dialogue among elites is really important, just because that's what other people are hearing. And then they also talk about institutional change as a solution to all of these things. And so this is looking at how inclined you are to seek compromise. And so among Democrats, 62% of Democrats think that their leaders should work with the other party. That's only 38% among Republicans. And so all of these things lead to a pretty grim view of the future where, it's hard to imagine any of these trends really stopping. It's hard to imagine people having more faith in the other side or finding a room for compromise. And so, thinking about unity is hard to, it's easy to view just like one side as the problem, and that's definitely not the case, especially Democrats. They really segregated on the coasts. So the big government party doesn't have a great understanding of what a lot of the country is going through. Well, at the same time, this article does point the finger more towards Republicans, which I think is kind of fair, because thinking about the last 4 years, it's hard to imagine a more divisive figure than Donald Trump. Thinking about, unity where the leader of one side, the mouthpiece, was saying that white supremacists were good people. He was telling insurrectionists that he loved them. Thinking about the election result, half of leaders of one party voted against democracy and the will of the courts. And so, unity is very important, but unity isn't just about singing Kumbaya. Unity is about having some shared principles and some basic understandings of what right and wrong is.